Catherine did not hesitate, argue, or ask for an explanation. She simply rose from her place and walked out. The palace reception had been arranged to display royal unity, but the moment Meghan entered and was guided toward the honored seat reserved beside the king, Catherine's expression changed. Within seconds, the princess pushed back her chair, crossed the room in complete silence, and left stunned guests staring after her. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room froze behind her. Buckingham Palace had welcomed senior royals, foreign representatives, charity leaders, and carefully selected guests for an evening meant to prove that the family could still stand together. A palace reception is a formal royal gathering where invitations, entrances, and seating positions carry public meaning. Every chair near the monarch had been approved in advance, because proximity to the king could signal trust, rank, and future influence. Catherine had been given the honored place beside Charles for a reason. The seat recognized years of discipline, duty, and steady service, but it also pointed toward her future beside William when he eventually inherited the crown. Moments before dinner, however, an aide approached the table, lifted her name card, and replaced it without explanation. Meghan was then escorted directly toward the place Catherine had been expected to occupy. William saw the change and remained seated for several painful seconds. The prince looked toward his wife, then toward his father, caught between following her and preventing the reception from collapsing into open scandal. Meghan lowered herself into the chair while every nearby conversation died. She had not arrived expecting warmth, but the weight of so many shocked faces made the welcome feel like a public challenge rather than a victory. Charles set down his glass and refused to meet his son's eyes. Camilla watched the doorway through which Catherine had disappeared, yet the queen consort made no move to call her back. Their stillness carried its own confession. A sealed instruction bearing the king's private approval had reached the reception staff less than 30 minutes before the doors opened, proving that the change had not been accidental. William finally pushed back his chair. Before he could leave, a senior courtier stepped close and spoke in a voice meant for him alone. This was not only about tonight. The warning suggested that Meghan's seat was tied to something larger: access, status, and Catherine's future authority inside the monarchy. Catherine had left the room, but the deeper wound was only beginning to surface, because behind that single empty chair stood 4 people with everything to lose. The reception did not create the fracture. It exposed the pain each person had been hiding. Catherine saw the honored seat as recognition of years spent carrying duty without complaint. Meghan saw it as proof that she had finally been invited back on equal terms. William saw an attack on his wife's dignity. Charles saw one desperate opportunity to repair a family that had been breaking in public for years. Catherine stopped in a private corridor and forced herself to breathe. For years, the princess had built her place through silence, discipline, and loyalty, even when every choice was examined. The honored seat beside the king was more than a chair. It marked her as a central figure in the monarchy's future, and acknowledged the role she would one day carry beside William. Watching that place handed to someone else had felt like seeing years of service erased in seconds. William reached her moments later, but she did not turn immediately. The prince had followed after a delay that now felt impossible to explain. When she finally faced him, her eyes were wet but steady. "Did you know?" she asked. He hesitated. That brief silence wounded her more deeply than a direct answer, because it suggested he had known something might happen, even if he had not understood how far the decision would go. Meghan remained inside the reception with one hand gripping the edge of the table beneath the cloth. She had expected cold looks and quiet judgment after years of distance from royal life. The invitation had been carefully negotiated, and every gesture toward her would be judged as either acceptance or rejection. Yet Catherine's departure changed the meaning of the moment. What had seemed like restoration now felt like a trap designed to place both women on opposite sides of the same humiliation. Charles watched the room struggle to recover. The king had privately promised Meghan a visible gesture of restoration during an earlier recorded conversation, believing that symbolic recognition might reopen communication with Harry. He had wanted to repair the distance without making a formal announcement. Instead, his gesture had created a new wound in front of witnesses who understood exactly what the seat represented. William finally admitted that he had received a vague warning about a possible change in the seating plan. He had been assured Catherine's position would remain protected, yet someone inside the royal household, the group of staff managing official palace duties, had hidden the true meaning of the instruction. The future king promised he would discover who changed the wording and why. Catherine looked back toward the closed reception doors. Her voice was quiet, but there was no uncertainty left in it. The person who moved the card is not the person who made the decision. To understand why Catherine believed the humiliation had come from the very top, William would have to return to the moment when one private promise changed everything. 3 weeks before the reception, a private meeting at Clarence's house created the crisis no one could later contain. Charles had entered the room, hoping to secure peace between two divided branches of his family. Instead, one request from Meghan, one reluctant promise from the king, and one overheard sentence transformed a gesture of reconciliation into a direct challenge to Catherine's place inside the monarchy. Charles had arranged the conversation after receiving a private message from Harry. The Duke warned that any future reconciliation would feel empty unless Meghan was treated with visible respect, not merely welcomed behind closed doors. Clarence's house, the king's London residence, became the setting for a meeting deliberately kept away from cameras, public statements, and the wider royal household. Only the monarch, Meghan, and one private secretary were present. Meghan entered determined not to accept another symbolic humiliation. She told Charles she would attend the palace reception only if she was not placed behind the future queen as a tolerated guest. The words landed hard. He paused, looked down at the papers before him, and promised she would receive a position showing that she remained part of the family. That single assurance became the point of no return. Catherine learned fragments of the exchange days later from an aide's documented account. The staff member had passed the doorway and heard Charles say, "She must be seen beside me." The princess understood immediately what those words could mean. Her years of loyalty, discipline, and public restraint now seemed to be the price offered to secure temporary peace with Harry and his wife. Charles later issued a written instruction calling for Meghan to receive the senior place of honor available beside the sovereign. The sovereign simply means the reigning monarch, the person who formally sits at the center of royal authority. Yet the order never said Catherine should be removed. It left the final interpretation to a powerful courtier who understood that only one chair beside the king carried the highest symbolic weight. Camilla then pressed the matter further during a private recorded conversation with her husband. The queen consort argued that a visible gesture would force William and Catherine to accept reconciliation instead of resisting it in private. Once the arrangement became public, she believed no one would risk creating a scene. Her confidence rested on one assumption: Catherine would endure the insult quietly. That calculation failed the instant the princess stood up. William now held a copied version of the altered seating order, and beneath the king's approved wording appeared one handwritten addition that changed everything. Move the princess if necessary. With the altered order in his hand, and Catherine waiting for the truth, William was no longer seeking an explanation. He was preparing for a confrontation. William entered the king's private room, carrying the seating order like evidence, then closed the door behind him. There were no aides, no advisors, and no ceremonial language to soften what followed. Charles stood near the fireplace, while Camilla remained beside a writing desk. The prince placed the document between them, and demanded to know who had decided that Catherine's dignity could be sacrificed for Meghan's return. William rarely challenged his father in front of another family member, but this was no longer a disagreement over palace protocol. Protocol means the formal rules that control royal events, rank, and public behavior. Catherine's walkout had turned those rules into a personal betrayal, and the future king wanted more than an explanation. He wanted the truth spoken aloud by the people who had allowed it to happen. Charles insisted that his intention had been reconciliation, not humiliation. The king believed placing Meghan near him would show that the family could move beyond years of hostility without changing anyone's formal rank. He spoke carefully, but his defense weakened when William pushed the altered order across the desk and pointed to the handwritten sentence beneath the approved instruction. "Read it," William said. Charles lowered his eyes to the page. The monarch studied the words, set the paper down, and remained silent. That silence carried more weight than denial. It told the prince that his father had either failed to understand what he signed, or had chosen not to ask who would be hurt by it. Camilla finally admitted she had supported a stronger public gesture toward Meghan, though she denied writing the final instruction. The queen consort argued that the family needed one decisive act to break the cycle of rejection. William turned toward her with controlled fury and said Catherine had never been an obstacle to peace until someone chose to make her one. Charles then revealed the detail that changed the confrontation. Earlier that morning, he had signed a reconciliation memorandum without reading the final seating attachment. A memorandum is a written instruction used to record an official decision. His private secretary had assured him that both royal households had agreed to every detail. William lifted the page again and studied the handwriting. He had seen those same narrow letters and sharp markings on earlier palace briefing papers connected to Camilla's senior advisor. What first looked like a rushed seating change now appeared deliberate, a coordinated attempt to weaken Catherine's public position while hiding behind the king's authority. William moved toward the door, but stopped before opening it. He told Charles that Catherine would not return to another engagement until the palace publicly named who had authorized her removal. The monarch understood the choice immediately: expose the truth or protect those closest to him. The argument ended with no apology and no agreement, but the document left on the desk had already changed who held power inside the palace. The most powerful person in the palace was not the one who moved the chair, but the one whose signature made resistance impossible. Charles had approved reconciliation in principle, Camilla's advisor had shaped the wording, and the household had carried it out without questioning the human cost. Now the king sat alone with the document, forced to decide whether protecting the crown meant defending his decision or admitting it had been manipulated. Charles read the original memorandum again after midnight. A royal seating order is more than a list of chairs. It is an official expression of rank, trust, and public standing. Staff members rarely challenge instructions linked to the sovereign, because even one altered place can suggest recognition for one person and rejection for another. The king removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and whispered that he had wanted his sons back, not another battle between their wives. Catherine refused the private apology sent through an aide. The princess told William that hidden comfort could not repair a public humiliation. She had been replaced before senior royals, foreign guests, and charity leaders, so any answer delivered quietly would only protect the people responsible. The future king understood her point. His father controlled invitations and ceremonial placement, yet the monarchy's stability increasingly depended on William and his wife, continuing to appear united beside him. Charles summoned Camilla's senior advisor before dawn and placed the altered instruction on the desk. The courtier admitted adding the words, "Move the princess if necessary," and defended the decision in a recorded account prepared for the king. He argued that Meghan might have refused the honored place if Catherine remained beside the monarch, making the entire reconciliation gesture appear weak and meaningless. The advisor's confidence disturbed Charles more than the confession itself. He had treated the princess as an obstacle to be moved, not a person whose loyalty had helped carry the institution through years of strain. Formal authority still belonged to the king, but practical power was shifting toward the couple expected to lead the monarchy next. Without their cooperation, royal unity would become an empty performance. Camilla's role then became impossible to ignore. The queen consort had seen the revised wording before the reception and raised no objection. Her silence proved she understood exactly who would lose the seat and what that removal would communicate. Charles ordered her advisor removed from all ceremonial planning, but he delayed announcing the reason, fearing the damage a public admission might cause. That hesitation created something worse. Competing versions of the walkout began moving beyond palace walls before Catherine's truth could be heard. By morning, the private betrayal had become a public crisis, and every silence from the palace made Catherine's departure appear even more devastating. The morning after Catherine walked out, Buckingham Palace no longer felt like one household. Staff members whispered behind closed doors, scheduled appearances were suddenly questioned, and two competing statements appeared on separate desks. One described the incident as a misunderstanding. The other acknowledged that Catherine's place had been deliberately reassigned. Only one could be released, and choosing between them meant choosing whom the palace was prepared to betray. Catherine's team cancelled her next public engagement before breakfast, saying she needed private time. A public engagement is an official appearance carried out on behalf of the crown, and withdrawing from one without warning immediately signals that something serious has happened. She had rarely stepped back from duty, even during periods of intense pressure. This cancellation told the palace that her anger had not faded overnight. Catherine sat at the breakfast table with the place setting before her untouched. William watched her carefully and asked whether she regretted leaving the reception. The princess did not raise her voice. "I regret that staying would have taught them they could do it again." The prince understood the warning beneath those words. This was no longer about one chair. It was about whether loyalty could be punished without consequence. Meghan left Buckingham Palace before sunrise without speaking to the waiting press. Inside a private car, she read the first wave of online headlines and recoiled when one described her as having seized Catherine's seat. Harry listened as his wife insisted she had been promised that place. She refused to accept blame for an instruction issued by the king's household, yet he knew public anger rarely waited for palace details. Charles faced two prepared statements and trusted neither. The first called the seating change an accidental misunderstanding. The second admitted that Catherine's approved position had been deliberately reassigned. The king knew the first version might protect the palace for a few hours, but it would deepen the betrayal if evidence appeared. That evidence already existed. A communications officer discovered that the original seating chart had been photographed before the alteration. The image clearly showed Catherine's name beside Charles, while Meghan's place appeared several seats away. William obtained a copy and warned the palace that he would release it if officials tried to disguise the truth with careful wording. Charles set both statements aside. Instead of approving either version, the monarch sent a private request asking Catherine to meet him. She agreed, but her conditions stunned the household. Meghan had to be present, and no aides would be allowed inside. The next meeting would have no courtiers to absorb the blame, no documents to hide behind, and no empty chair between the women at its center. For the first time since the reception, Catherine and Meghan stood in the same room without aides, advisors, or carefully prepared statements. Charles had brought them together, expecting anger, but the confrontation began with silence. Catherine placed the photographed seating chart on the table. Meghan looked at it, then admitted she had never been shown the original arrangement. In that moment, both women understood they had been positioned against each other. Catherine remained standing while Charles closed the door. Only William stayed beside her, and no secretary was allowed inside to soften, record, or reshape what was said. This was no longer an institutional discussion. It was four people facing the damage created by one decision, with no palace machinery available to carry the blame. Charles spoke first. The king said the gesture had been meant to reassure Harry and Meghan that they had not been erased from the family. He admitted the plan had turned reconciliation into a public ranking contest. A reconciliation gesture is a symbolic act meant to rebuild trust after conflict. But this one had failed, because it lifted one person by visibly lowering another. Catherine finally looked at Meghan and spoke without anger. The princess said the pain had not come from seeing her welcomed back. It came from watching her own name card removed without warning, as though years of service could be pushed aside in seconds. That moment had made duty feel disposable, and silence had made the insult worse. Meghan answered with equal restraint. She said she had never asked for Catherine to be removed, and would not have taken the chair had she seen the original plan. Remaining seated after the walkout, she admitted, had been a mistake driven by shock and pride. The Duchess understood that her stillness had looked like triumph, even though she had felt trapped. Charles then confirmed the truth recorded in the advisor's written account. Camilla's senior aide had altered the instruction, and the queen consort had seen the revised wording before the reception. The monarch accepted responsibility because his signature had given the order power, even if he had not written its most damaging line. Meghan offered to release a joint statement admitting she had never been entitled to Catherine's place, and confirming that the arrangement had been changed without the princess's consent. Catherine did not answer at once. The silence stretched until even William looked uncertain. Catherine finally agreed, but her condition was firm. The palace had to name the decision, accept responsibility, and refuse to blame either woman. Charles now faced the choice he had tried to avoid: protect Camilla or protect the truth. The women had stopped fighting each other, but the monarchy still had to confess what it had done before the outside world delivered its own verdict. By midday, one photograph destroyed every attempt to call the walkout a misunderstanding. The image showed two seating charts side by side, Catherine's name beside the king on the original, and Meghan's name occupying that exact place on the revised version. The change was clear, deliberate, and impossible to explain away. Across Britain, the empty chair became a symbol of how quickly loyalty could be displaced by palace calculation. Major broadcasters received the photograph before Buckingham Palace released its statement. A seating chart is the official plan showing where each guest will sit, while royal precedence is the order of rank that determines who stands or sits closest to the monarch. Commentators immediately understood that this was not a small adjustment. Catherine had been publicly moved from a place carrying deep symbolic authority. Charles could no longer delay. The king approved a statement confirming that an unauthorized handwritten addition had changed the original plan. He accepted responsibility for signing the wider instruction and announced that the advisor involved had been dismissed. The admission was carefully worded, but it still exposed a palace decision that had been hidden behind silence. William watched the broadcast beside Catherine as the presenter read every line. The prince expected relief, perhaps even anger, but she showed neither. The princess lowered her eyes and said she wished the truth had arrived before the humiliation. Vindication could not erase the moment her name card was lifted while an entire room watched. Meghan approved the joint statement from a private residence after reviewing it with Harry. She acknowledged that she had accepted the honored seat without knowing Catherine had been removed from it. She also expressed regret for remaining seated after the walkout, admitting that shock and pride had stopped her from responding with compassion. Camilla's role became impossible to hide. The statement confirmed that the queen consort had seen the amended instruction before the reception. It did not accuse her of writing the change, but her silence was described as a serious failure of judgment. For the public, that distinction offered little protection. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered beneath the balcony as reporters spoke into live cameras. A newspaper vendor raised a front page showing Catherine's abandoned chair beneath the headline, "The Seat That Split the Palace." Strangers pointed toward the image, and the story stopped being a private royal dispute. It became a national judgment about loyalty, power, and fairness. Charles understood that sympathy had shifted sharply toward Catherine. Restoring her place could not be a temporary gesture. It had to permanently define her authority at future royal events. The nation had seen who was removed, who remained silent, and who finally admitted the truth. Now the crown had to decide what justice would look like. Catherine returned to Buckingham Palace not to reclaim a chair, but to reclaim the principle that duty cannot be erased without consequence. 1 week after the walkout, Charles gathered the senior family and issued a final ceremonial order. Her place beside the sovereign at major receptions would be formally protected. Meghan would never be used as a symbol against her again, and hidden palace maneuvering would no longer decide public honor. Charles signed a revised protocol before the meeting began. A royal protocol is an official set of rules controlling ceremony, rank, and conduct inside the monarchy. The new order required every seating plan involving senior working royals to receive written approval from all affected households. No advisor could make a private change after final confirmation, and no hidden instruction could again carry more weight than the people it harmed. Catherine listened as her position was formally reaffirmed. The princess would remain the leading female figure after the Queen, reflecting her years of public duty and her future beside William. The decision did not erase Meghan from the family, but it separated personal reconciliation from royal hierarchy. Welcoming someone back could no longer mean pushing someone else aside. Charles later asked to speak with Catherine alone. The king apologized without excuses, admitting that his desire to repair one damaged relationship had wounded another person who had stood beside the crown through years of pressure. She accepted his words, but her answer was firm. Trust, she said, would return through actions, not titles, protected seats, or carefully written promises. William watched her speak with calm control. The prince understood that her walkout had never been surrender. It had been a boundary, drawn at the exact moment silence would have allowed humiliation to become precedent. Camilla withdrew from ceremonial planning, while her advisor's dismissal became permanent. The Queen Consort's silence over the altered wording was recorded internally as a failure of judgment that could neither be hidden nor repeated. Meghan then sent Catherine a private handwritten note. She acknowledged that both women had been placed inside a conflict designed by others and expressed regret for remaining seated. The princess replied briefly, accepting the apology, without pretending years of tension had disappeared. At the next palace reception, Catherine entered beside William and took her restored place next to Charles. Meghan was welcomed respectfully at a separate family table. No one was humiliated. No chair was taken through secrecy. The monarchy had learned its final lesson. Reconciliation, built on another woman's displacement, is not peace. Catherine's departure lasted only minutes, but its meaning endured. She walked out as a woman publicly disregarded, and returned as the person who forced the palace to choose dignity over manipulation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.